And speaking of COVID, moving on, we've kind of turning this into a little bit of a segment we do every week, but we're just kind of sort of recap how COVID is still affecting the NFL and the Lions. And as of right now, there's still only one player that is currently remaining on the NFL COVID list. I'm not sure. Do you still know who that is, Jimmy? That was one player?
I don't know who that is, and I think it may have added a second player just in the past couple days. So there are very, very few players on the
Yeah.
COVID list. And one thing we have to remember about the COVID reserve list is you can test positive and not go on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Colbert, the Steelers GM, confirmed this last week that a positive test does not immediately or automatically put you on the list. Teams will try to hide you for 2, 3 days, come up with an excuse while you're not at practice, try to get a couple negative tests done the next day, and get you off the list quickly before having to release anything publicly. So don't
Mm-hmm.
take this COVID reserve list at face value. There are likely players testing positive that you are not hearing about.
Yep. Yeah, I guarantee it. So there's probably way more. And if the NFL actually released, or if the players, or if anyone ever released how many players have tested positive, I'm sure it'd be way more than we actually thought. And
Right. For
again,
example, under the current policy, Stafford would not have gotten put on the list.
mhm,
Nobody would even have found out about the positive test. He would have missed a couple days of practice for a sore shoulder or something, and nobody would have known about it.
yeah, yeah, it's going to be crazy. I'm sure teams have been manipulating this whole COVID list since it started. So, and I'm sure they're going to manipulate it during the season too. Because speaking of that, I know the NFL also mentioned that they're going to try to avoid doing tests 2 days before games. So, how exactly is the NFL going to be doing their testing involving game day?
Yeah, Tom Pelissero reported this rumor that they're going to try to have their final test on a Friday before the game. That way, if there's any positive tests, they can try to get those negative tests on Saturday so that the player can play on Sunday, which
Hmm.
is according to the current protocol. The ideal situation, in my opinion, I've been saying this for a while, is to test players Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the Sunday games.
Hmm.
For games on Thursday night or Monday nighters, you adjust the schedule. So Thursday night, the last test would be on Tuesday night. For Monday nighters, you could test Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. It's pretty easy to adjust the testing schedule for specific teams.
Hmm.
And this is to avoid that game day chaos. This is to avoid players from missing games due to a COVID positive test.
Hmm. Yeah,
I
like,
think the NFL has really two primary interests here regarding COVID. The first is to keep players as safe as possible,
mhm,
which I think is actually a fairly easy priority for the NFL because the risk of any serious issue with a pro athlete from COVID is extremely low. I've yet to hear of a pro athlete in the entire world who had severe issues related to COVID.
mhm.
Even if every single NFL player got COVID during the season, the likelihood of a single one having severe symptoms would be very low. And I think the NFL, to some degree, or even to a large degree, realizes this. Which brings us to the second priority they have, which is to keep the positive test count low or even hidden, which is good for optics and decreases the impact on games. Now, these two priorities are not necessarily opposing priorities, so they can work together. Uh, I think the NFL does not want positive tests. Positive tests make people worry. They make people question whether teams should even play football. It gives fuel to all the NFL critics out there, which there are a ton of.
Yep.
They love to bash the NFL. Uh, so the NFL wants to keep the positive test down. There are many ways that they can do it. We just mentioned a couple minutes ago that they don't necessarily announce a positive test right away or put a player on the COVID reserve list. They have that 90-day exemption now after a positive test. So you don't even need to test a guy for 90 days. You could test positive 10 times in those 90 days if they were testing them, but they're not even testing them. So it's a don't test, don't know policy, which I'm not disagreeing with. That's the CDC guideline, which is perfectly fine. And I'm not criticizing the NFL for any of these priorities. I think it's good
Mhm.
to try to keep that positive test count low, to decrease the criticism of the NFL and to keep the games moving, keep the season moving.
Yeah.
because, as I said, the risk of a severe issue related to COVID is so low with these pro athletes.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of stemming off of that statement again, following last week's terrible false positive sort of epidemic that it all came from one testing lab, what kind of update can you give us on what sort of happened last week with that whole, what was it? I think 40 some players had a false positive or something like that altogether.
There are 77 positives. So
77.
this is the final recap. We finally got all the information out. Last podcast, it was breaking news. We didn't have all the information yet, but
Yeah.
here's the final deal. One lab out of five had a spike in positives. There were 77 positives. They redid all the samples from the original test, apparently, and all the original samples came back negative on the subsequent test. Also, future tests came back negative for those players as well. So, this is one of the rare instances where I would be comfortable calling these tests false positives. It looks like it was due to some kind of lab error, and I would just throw out the results of these tests completely. These players should not be receiving the 90-day test exemption because these aren't positive tests or true
Mhm.
positives. So that's the summary as far as the false positive scenario. And again, I want to say this is not what happened with the Matthew Stafford positive test.
Yeah.
It does not look like this was some kind of anomalous outbreak of positives. This was a positive test for one guy, likely to be a true positive. It still could be a false positive, sure, but there's no way to definitively say it's a false positive.
Mhm.
Uh, and Dr. Sills again stated that it was likely a true positive. He likely had virus in his system.
Mhm.
Hopefully, this means that Stafford gets a 90-day test exemption. That would be good for us fans as well as any fantasy footballers who want to draft him.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. And I'm not sure exactly if the NFL can come out and publicly, if they have to publicly state if he has a 90-day exemption or not. So,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they do, but where are the reporters asking these questions? I've yet to see a single reporter ask this question of anybody. I mean, come on, guys, get out there, ask the team, is Stafford on a 90-day test exemption or not? Let's get
exactly.
this information. I think fans would like to know this.
I agree. We need those hard hitting questions out there. So,